The Royal Guard's morning duty. First rays of morning sunlight painted the ancient stones of Windsor Castle in warm golden hues, casting long shadows across the historic courtyard where countless generations of British soldiers had walked before. The air was crisp, with the promise of another busy tourist day. And already small groups of visitors were beginning to gather near the ornate iron gates, cameras ready, and their voices filled with excitement and anticipation. Standing at attention near the main entrance, Guardsman James Mitchell cut an imposing figure against the backdrop of centuries-old architecture. His scarlet-red tunic was immaculately pressed, every button polished to perfection, and his black bearskin hat sat proudly atop his head like a crown of military tradition. The morning light caught the gleam of his perfectly polished boots and the brass fittings of his uniform, creating an almost ethereal glow around this living symbol of British military excellence. James had been awake since 4:30 that morning, following the same meticulous routine he had perfected over 15 years of service. His uniform inspection had taken nearly an hour, with every thread, every crease, and every insignia checked and double-checked until it met the exacting standards of the Coldstream Guards. His rifle, a precision instrument that was both ceremonial and fully functional, had been cleaned and inspected with the same attention to detail that had kept him alive during 3 tours of duty. In some of the world's most dangerous places, the weight of his bearskin hat was familiar and comforting, a reminder of the unbroken chain of tradition that stretched back over 3.5 centuries. Each guard who had worn this uniform before him had contributed to its legacy, and James felt the profound responsibility of maintaining that heritage with every breath he took. His posture was perfect, his expression stoic and professional, his eyes alert and constantly scanning the growing crowd for any potential threats or disturbances. Behind his composed exterior, James carried memories that most civilians could never imagine. His chest bore ribbons and medals that told stories of courage under fire, of split-second decisions that had saved lives, and of moments when his training and dedication had made the difference between life and death. The military cross pinned to his tunic had been earned during a firefight in Helmand Province, where he had crawled through enemy fire to rescue 4 wounded soldiers, dragging them one by one to safety while bullets whistled overhead and explosions shook the ground beneath his feet. But those experiences, as defining as they were, represented only part of his service. James had also stood guard during state funerals, his unwavering presence providing comfort to grieving families and dignity to solemn ceremonies. He had protected visiting dignitaries from countries around the world, his vigilance ensuring that international relations could proceed smoothly and safely. He had been part of security details during terrorist alerts that never made the news, his professionalism helping to prevent tragedies that the public would never know about. The tourists gathering in the courtyard saw only the ceremonial aspect of his role, the colorful uniform and traditional pageantry that made for excellent photographs and exciting stories to share with friends back home. They had no way of knowing that beneath the ceremonial exterior stood a hardened combat veteran, a man who had been tested in the crucible of modern warfare and had emerged with his honor and dedication intact. As the morning progressed, the crowd grew larger and more animated. Families with children pointed excitedly at James, their young ones wide-eyed with wonder at seeing a real lifeguard from their storybooks. Elderly couples spoke in hushed, respectful tones about the tradition and history he represented. International visitors took countless photographs, eager to capture their encounter with this iconic symbol of British culture and military prowess. James acknowledged none of this activity directly, as his training and protocol demanded. His role required him to maintain his position with unwavering discipline, to be simultaneously present and removed, visible yet untouchable. This was not aloofness or arrogance, but rather a professional requirement that served multiple purposes. It maintained the dignity of his position, preserved the mystique of the ceremonial tradition, and allowed him to remain alert to genuine security concerns without being distracted by tourist interactions. The morning air carried the sounds of London awakening around the castle grounds. Traffic hummed in the distance, Birds sang from the ancient trees that dotted the landscape, and the voices of tour guides began their practiced recitations of historical facts and royal trivia. Through it all, James remained a constant, unmovable presence, a living link between the modern world and the centuries of tradition that had shaped the British military. His training had prepared him for every aspect of this duty, from the physical demands of standing motionless for hours to the mental discipline required to maintain focus despite countless distractions. He had learned to breathe in a way that kept his body relaxed while his mind stayed sharp, to distribute his weight so that he could remain stable and alert throughout his shift, and to maintain his composure regardless of weather conditions, crowd behavior, or unexpected situations. The psychological aspects of his role were equally important and equally challenging. Tourists would sometimes try to make him laugh, to get him to break character, or to provoke some kind of reaction. Children might run up to him unexpectedly. Adults might make inappropriate comments or gestures, and occasionally, individuals would become aggressive or demanding when he failed to respond to their attempts at interaction. James had seen it all during his years of service, and he had developed an almost zen-like ability to remain centered and professional regardless of external pressures. His mind was trained to categorize and dismiss distractions while remaining alert to legitimate concerns. A child's innocent approach was different from an adult's aggressive demand, which was different again from a suspicious individual who might pose an actual security risk. As the sun climbed higher and the tourist crowds grew denser, James settled into the rhythm of another day of duty. His role was both simple and complex: to stand guard, to represent centuries of military tradition, to maintain security, and to embody the values and professionalism of the British Armed Forces. It was a responsibility he had never taken lightly, and one that filled him with quiet pride every single day he put on the uniform. Little did he know that this particular morning would test his professionalism in ways he had never experienced before, and that his response would become a story told and retold by witnesses who would never forget what they were about to witness. Karen's arrival and entitled demands the peaceful morning atmosphere around Windsor Castle was about to be shattered by the arrival of Karen Thompson, a woman whose very presence seemed to disturb the natural order of things wherever she went. She emerged from a luxury tour bus with the kind of aggressive confidence that immediately put everyone around her on edge, her designer handbag swinging like a weapon as she surveyed the historic surroundings with the critical eye of someone who had already decided to find fault with everything she encountered. Karen was the embodiment of middle-aged entitlement, a walking stereotype who had perfected the art of making service workers miserable. Through years of practice and an unshakable belief that the world existed primarily for her convenience and pleasure, her blonde hair was styled in what had become universally known as the Karen cut short, severely angled, and somehow managing to look both expensive and tasteless at the same time. Her oversized designer sunglasses, probably worth more than most people's monthly salary, reflected not just the morning sunlight, but also her complete disconnection from reality and common courtesy. Everything about Karen's appearance screamed money without class. Her clothing was undoubtedly expensive, bearing the logos and labels of high-end designers, but worn in a way that suggested she valued price tags more than actual style or appropriateness. Her jewelry clinked and jangled with every movement, a symphony of conspicuous consumption that announced her presence long before her voice joined the chorus. Her shoes, stiletto heels completely inappropriate for walking on historic cobblestones, clicked against the ancient stones like a countdown. Timer 2, inevitable confrontation. From the moment she stepped off the tour bus, Karen had been complaining. The bus ride had been too long, despite being exactly the duration advertised. The hotel breakfast hadn't met her standards, even though other guests had praised it enthusiastically. The weather was too sunny, too cloudy, too warm, or too cool, sometimes all in the same sentence. Her fellow tourists had learned to avoid eye contact and maintain their distance. Recognizing the warning signs of someone who fed off conflict and attention like a vampire feeds off blood, "This place better be worth all the hassle," she announced loudly, to no one in particular. her American accent carrying across the courtyard with the subtlety of a foghorn. "I've paid good money for this tour, and I expect to get some decent photos for my social media. These places are all the same, old buildings and boring history lessons." The tour guide, a patient woman named Margaret, who had been leading visitors through Windsor Castle for over 20 years, tried to maintain her professional enthusiasm despite Karen's constant interruptions and complaints. Margaret had dealt with difficult tourists before, but Karen was already proving to be in a category all her own. Every historical fact was met with skepticism. Every interesting story was dismissed as probably made up, and every attempt to engage the group in the wonder of their surroundings was undermined by Karen's running commentary of criticism. "Now, if we look to our left," Margaret said, gesturing toward James's position near the main entrance, "we can see one of Her Majesty's guards. These soldiers are not just ceremonial figures, they are active military personnel with real duties and responsibilities. We ask that visitors maintain a respectful distance and remember that these guards are working professionals." Karen's head snapped toward James like a predator spotting prey. Here, finally, was something that might provide her with the entertainment and attention she craved. She had seen similar guards in movies and television shows, always portrayed as stoic figures who never moved or reacted, regardless of what happened around them. In Karen's mind, this made them perfect targets for her particular brand of aggressive demands and boundary-pushing behavior. "Oh, perfect," she exclaimed, already striding away from the tour group toward James's position. "I need some good photos for Instagram. This is exactly what I was looking for," Margaret called after her. "Mrs. Thompson, please remember what I said about maintaining distance and showing respect." But Karen was already gone, her stiletto heels clicking rapidly against the cobblestones as she approached. James, with the single-minded determination of someone who had never been told no and didn't intend to start accepting it now. The other tourists watched with growing unease, some already reaching for their phones to record what they sensed might become an uncomfortable situation. As Karen drew closer to James, her entitlement seemed to expand and intensify, filling the space around her like a toxic cloud. She had already decided that this uniformed figure existed solely for her entertainment and convenience, a living prop in the elaborate theater of her vacation experience. The idea that he might be a real person with real duties and real authority never crossed her mind, or if it did, was immediately dismissed as irrelevant to her needs and desires. "Excuse me?" she called out in a voice that carried clearly across the morning air, cutting through the respectful murmurs of other tourists like a knife through silk. "You there in the fancy costume?" James remained perfectly still, his training and discipline keeping him focused on his duties despite the approaching disturbance. He had dealt with difficult tourists before, and his protocol was clear: maintain position, ignore provocations, and alert security only if a genuine threat materialized. But something about Karen's tone and approach already suggested that this encounter might test his professionalism in new and challenging ways. "I said excuse me," Karen repeated, her voice rising in both volume and indignation as she closed the remaining distance between herself and James's position. "Don't you dare ignore me when I'm talking to you." The other tourists began to take notice, some moving closer to see what was happening, while others instinctively backed away, sensing the potential for an unpleasant scene. Children tugged at their parents' hands, asking why the lady was shouting at the nice soldier. Elderly visitors shook their heads disapprovingly, recognizing behavior that would have been unthinkable in their generation. Karen positioned herself directly in front of James, close enough that her perfume, an overpowering floral scent that seemed to match her personality and its aggressive intensity, reached his nostrils. She stood with her hands on her hips, her body language radiating the kind of aggressive entitlement that had made her persona non grata at restaurants, hotels, and customer service counters across multiple continents. "I want to take some pictures with you," she announced, not as a request, but as a demand, her tone suggesting that compliance was not optional. "So stop this ridiculous standing around act and pose with me. I need good content for my followers." James's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, his expression unchanged, his posture perfect. Years of military training and discipline had prepared him for many challenging situations. But dealing with entitled tourists who viewed him as a tourist attraction rather than a serving soldier required a different kind of patience and professionalism. The morning sun continued to climb higher, casting shifting shadows across the ancient courtyard where centuries of British military history had played out. Soon, Karen's demands would escalate, and James would face a test of his composure and dignity that would be remembered by everyone present. The stage was set for a confrontation that would demonstrate the difference between true professionalism and empty entitlement, between earned respect and demanded attention. But for now, in these final moments of relative calm, James maintained his vigil, unaware that his training, his character, and his dedication to service were about to be challenged in ways he had never experienced before. The confrontation escalates. Karen's frustration mounted with each passing second that James failed to acknowledge her presence or respond to her demands. In her world, immediate compliance was not just expected but guaranteed, achieved through a combination of raised voices, threatening reviews, and demands to speak with managers. The concept that someone might have legitimate reasons to ignore her, or that her desires might not take precedence over professional duties, was completely foreign to her experience and understanding. "Are you deaf or just stupid?" she snapped, her voice rising to a level that caused nearby pigeons to scatter and made several tourists turn their heads in alarm. "I'm talking to you. When a paying customer wants something, you're supposed to provide it." The tour guide Margaret hurried over, her professional smile strained with the effort of maintaining diplomacy while managing an increasingly volatile situation. "Mrs. Thompson, please, I really must ask you to step back and rejoin the group. The guards have very specific protocols they must follow, and they cannot engage with tourists during their duties." Karen whirled around to face Margaret, her designer, sunglasses reflecting the morning light like mirrors of indignation. "Don't you tell me what I can and cannot do. I've paid for this tour, which makes me a customer, and the customer is always right. This man is obviously here for tourists too. Take pictures with, so he needs to do his job." "Ma'am, with all due respect, you're mistaken," Margaret replied, her voice remaining calm despite the challenging circumstances. "These are active military personnel performing official duties. They're not entertainers or tourist attractions. They're serving soldiers who, serving soldiers." Karen interrupted with a laugh that was both harsh and dismissive. "Look at him. He's wearing a costume that looks like something from a Halloween store. Real soldiers wear camouflage and carry real weapons, not whatever that toy is supposed to be." The ignorance and disrespect contained in Karen's words sent ripples of shock through the growing crowd of onlookers. Many of the tourists were international visitors who had specifically come to see the famous guards. Understanding that they were witnessing a living piece of history and tradition, to hear someone dismiss centuries of military heritage as mere costume play was deeply offensive to people who appreciated the significance of what they were experiencing. James felt his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign that Karen's words had registered with him at all. His training had prepared him to ignore many types of provocation, but attacks on his professionalism and the honor of his regiment struck at the very core of his identity as a soldier. Still, his discipline held firm, his posture remained perfect, and his eyes stayed fixed on the middle distance, as protocol demanded. "I've had enough of this nonsense," Karen declared, stepping even closer to James until she was well within his personal space. "If you won't cooperate willingly, then I'll just have to take the pictures I want anyway." She pulled out her smartphone, a latest generation device that probably cost more than many people's monthly rent, and began snapping photos of James from various angles. But simple photography wasn't enough to satisfy her need for attention and control. She wanted interaction, reaction, acknowledgement that her presence and demands mattered. "Smile," she commanded, holding her phone up for a selfie attempt. "Come on, don't be difficult. Give me one little smile for the camera." When James continued to maintain his professional composure, Karen's frustration boiled over into genuine anger. She had never encountered anyone who could resist her combination of demands, insults, and persistence. In her experience, everyone, eventually broke down and gave her what she wanted, if only to make her go away and stop creating a scene. "Fine. Be difficult," she snarled, circling around James like a predator looking for weakness. "But I'm not leaving until I get what I came for. I've traveled thousands of miles and spent thousands of dollars to be here. And some minimum wage actor in a costume is not going to ruin my vacation." The crowd of onlookers had grown considerably, with people abandoning their own sightseeing plans to witness the unfolding drama. Some were recording the encounter on their phones, instinctively understanding that they might be witnessing something that would become widely shared on social media. Others looked on with expressions of embarrassment and secondhand shame, mortified to be associated with Karen's behavior even as fellow tourists. Margaret made another attempt to defuse the situation. "Mrs. Thompson, I really must insist that you return to the group immediately. If you continue this behavior, I'll have no choice. But to contact security? Go ahead and call security," Karen shot back, her voice now loud enough to be heard across the entire courtyard. "I'd love to speak to someone in charge about the terrible service I'm receiving. This is supposed to be a world-class tourist destination, and instead I'm being treated like garbage by staff who won't even do their jobs properly." At this point, several other tourists began to speak up, their collective patience finally exhausted by Karen's behavior and the disruption it was causing to everyone's experience. "Ma'am, please just leave the guard alone," said an elderly British gentleman, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had served in the military himself. "He's doing his job and doing it properly. You're the one causing problems here. Mind your own business, old man," Karen snapped back without even looking at him. "This doesn't concern you." A young mother holding her daughter's hand stepped forward. "Actually, it does concern all of us. You're ruining everyone's visit with this tantrum. These guards are heroes who've served our country, and they deserve our respect, not this. Whatever this is supposed to be." Karen's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment, but rather than backing down, she doubled down on her aggressive approach. "Heroes? Are you kidding me? He's standing there doing nothing? Real heroes actually do things, not pose for pictures and funny hats." The gasps from the crowd were audible. Even tourists who didn't fully understand the historical significance of the Royal Guards recognized that Karen had crossed a line from mere rudeness into genuine disrespect for military service and sacrifice. James's hand still gripping his rifle in the proper position tightened almost imperceptibly. His breathing remained controlled, his posture unchanged. But those who looked closely might have noticed a subtle shift in his expression, a hardening around his eyes that suggested Karen's words were having an impact despite his professional composure. "That's enough," called out a voice from the crowd. "You should be ashamed of yourself." But Karen was beyond shame, beyond reason, beyond any consideration for the feelings or experiences of others. She had committed herself to this course of action, and her pride would not allow her to back down, regardless of how obvious it became that she was wrong. "I'm not the one who should be ashamed," she retorted, turning to address the crowd as if they were her audience. "I'm a paying customer who's being ignored and disrespected by someone who's supposed to be providing a service. If this guard was any good at his job, he'd understand that customer satisfaction comes first." The tension in the courtyard was now palpable, with Karen on one side and virtually everyone else, tourists, guides, and even castle staff who had been drawn by the commotion on the other. The morning that had started so peacefully had transformed into a standoff between entitlement and professionalism, between demands for attention and dedication to duty. But Karen wasn't finished yet. Her next words would push the situation beyond mere rudeness into territory that would finally force James to respond, setting the stage for a confrontation that would be remembered by everyone present as a masterclass in dignity under fire. The devastating accusation, the tension in Windsor Castle's courtyard had reached a breaking point, with Karen Thompson standing at the center of a growing circle of disapproving tourists and concerned staff members. Amazing. But rather than recognizing the universal condemnation of her behavior as a sign that she might be wrong, Karen interpreted it as evidence that she was surrounded by people who simply didn't understand how the world really worked. In her mind, she wasn't the problem. Everyone else was just too naive or too intimidated to demand the level of service they deserved. Drawing herself up to her full height and adjusting her designer sunglasses with theatrical flair, Karen prepared to deliver what she believed would be her knockout blow. It's a revelation that would expose the fraud she was convinced she had uncovered. She had spent years perfecting the art of finding weaknesses in service workers, exploiting every perceived vulnerability to get her way. And she was absolutely certain that she had identified the perfect target in the stoic figure of James Mitchell. "Know what I think?" she announced loudly, her voice carrying across the ancient stones with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her own brilliance. "I think this whole thing is completely fake. This isn't a real guard at all. It's just some actor they hired to stand around and look important for the tourists." The accusation hung in the morning air like a toxic cloud, its implications spreading outward to touch everyone present. The tourists who had been defending James fell silent, shocked by the audacity of Karen's claim. Margaret, the tour guide, closed her eyes briefly, as if hoping that when she opened them, this nightmare scenario would have resolved itself. Even the pigeons seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, remaining unusually still on their perches around the courtyard. But Karen was just getting started. Having made her accusation, she now felt compelled to present her evidence, to build her case like a prosecutor addressing a jury. The fact that her jury consisted of increasingly hostile strangers didn't deter her in the slightest, if anything. Their disapproval only convinced her that she was onto something big. "Think about it," she continued, gesturing dramatically at James as if he were an exhibit in a courtroom. "Have any of you actually seen him move? Has he done anything that proves he's a real soldier and not just some guy in a costume? I bet he's not even British. They probably hired him from some acting agency to stand here and look pretty for the cameras." The crowd's reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. Voices rose in protest, with tourists from around the world expressing their shock and disgust at Karen's baseless accusations, but their outrage only seemed to fuel her conviction that she had stumbled onto a conspiracy that needed to be exposed. "I've been to Disney World," she declared triumphantly, as if this qualified her. "As an expert on theatrical presentations, I know what fake soldiers look like, and this is exactly the same thing. They dress up actors in costumes and train them to stand still and look impressive, but it's all just an act designed to separate tourists from their money." James felt something crack inside his chest, a hairline fracture in the composure that had carried him through combat zones and ceremonial duties alike. The woman's ignorance was staggering, her disrespect absolute. But it was the casual dismissal of everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, that cut deepest. She was reducing 15 years of distinguished military service to a theme park attraction, dismissing his dedication and that of countless other guardsmen as nothing more than elaborate theater. His mind flashed involuntarily to moments that had defined his service, the weight of his fallen comrades' bodies as he carried them to safety under enemy fire, the pride he had felt when receiving his medals from senior officers, the solemn dignity of standing vigil during state occasions. Every ceremony he had participated in, every duty he had performed with honor and distinction, was being reduced by this ignorant woman to the level of a costumed performer at a tourist trap. "I'm going to expose this fraud," Karen continued, now fully committed to her conspiracy theory and apparently oblivious to the growing hostility of her audience. "I'm going to take pictures and post them online with the real story about how Windsor Castle tricks tourists with fake guards. Have a right to know what they're really paying for." She pulled out her phone again, this time not for casual tourist photos, but with the deliberate intention of gathering evidence for her planned expos. She began recording video, narrating her findings like an investigative journalist uncovering a major scandal. "This is Karen Thompson reporting from Windsor Castle, where I've discovered what appears to be a massive deception being perpetrated on innocent tourists," she said into her phone's camera, her voice taking on the affected tone of someone who believed she was performing a public service. "This so-called royal guard is clearly just an actor hired to pose for pictures. The absurdity of the situation would have been comical if it weren't so deeply offensive. Here was a woman with no military background, no understanding of British history or traditions, and no knowledge of the sacrifices made by the men who had worn this uniform. declaring herself qualified to determine the authenticity of one of the world's most respected military units. Margaret made one last desperate attempt to restore sanity to the situation. "Mrs. Thompson, please. You're making serious accusations without any basis in fact. These guards are genuine members of Her Majesty's military, with distinguished service records and service records." Kieran interrupted with a harsh laugh. "What service records? Show me his military ID. Show me proof that he's ever been in combat. I bet you can't, because this whole thing is fake." The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down in medieval combat. Karen stood there triumphantly, convinced that she had cornered her opponents in an impossible position. In her mind, the guard's continued silence was proof of her accusations. Evidence that he couldn't defend himself because there was no defense to offer. What Karen didn't understand, what she couldn't comprehend with her limited worldview and complete lack of empathy, was that she had just challenged the honor and authenticity of a man who had earned his position through blood, sweat, an unwavering dedication to something greater than himself. She had questioned not just his individual service, but the service of every guardsman who had stood in that position before him, every soldier who had worn that uniform with pride and distinction. The crowd of onlookers watched in fascination and horror as Karen's accusations grew more elaborate and more offensive. Some were recording the encounter, instinctively understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary, not because of Karen's accusations, which were obviously false, but because of the incredible restraint being shown by James. In the face of such unprecedented disrespect, children in the crowd looked confused, unable to understand why the angry lady was shouting at the nice soldier. Their parents held them closer, using the moment as an impromptu lesson about how not to behave in public and the importance of showing respect for people who serve their country. Elderly veterans in the crowd felt their own anger rising, remembering their own years of service and the sacrifices made by their generation. They recognized in James's stoic endurance the same dedication and professionalism that had defined their own military careers, and they were appalled to see it challenged so disrespectfully. But it was James himself who felt the full weight of Karen's accusations. Every word she spoke was like a physical blow, challenging not just his individual integrity, but the honor of his entire regiment. The tradition he represented and the sacrifices made by guardsmen throughout history, the breaking point was approaching. And when it came, it would demonstrate the difference between someone who had earned their position through service and sacrifice, and someone who believed that loudness and entitlement were substitutes for knowledge and respect. The epic shutdown, the moment of reckoning, had arrived. Karen Thompson stood in the Windsor Castle courtyard, her phone still recording, her voice still ringing with false accusations and manufactured outrage, completely unaware that she was about to experience a lesson in dignity, professionalism, and earned respect that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The crowd of onlookers held their collective breath, sensing that something significant was about to happen, though none of them could have predicted the masterful response they were about to witness. James Mitchell had reached his breaking point. But unlike Karen's explosive tantrum, his reaction would be measured, controlled, and devastating in its precision. Years of military training had taught him that the most effective responses often came not from anger or volume, but from quiet authority backed by unshakable truth. When he finally spoke, it would not be as an entertainer breaking character, but as a decorated soldier defending his honor, and that, for every guardsman who had ever worn the uniform, the transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Without moving from his position or changing his posture, James seemed to gather an invisible force around himself, an aura of command presence that every military person learns to recognize and respect. His eyes, which had remained fixed on the middle distance throughout Karen's tirade, shifted with deliberate precision to focus directly on her face. The change was so slight that a casual observer might have missed it, but its impact was immediate and profound. Karen still caught up in her performance for her phone's camera, initially failed to notice the shift. She was mid-sentence in another rambling accusation when she glanced up and found herself looking directly into the steady, unwavering gaze of a combat veteran whose patience had finally reached its end. The words died in her throat as she encountered something she had never seen before in her encounters with service workers: absolute moral authority. backed by genuine experience and unshakable conviction. "Madam," James said, his voice cutting through the morning air with the precision of a perfectly sharpened blade. The single word carried such weight, such quiet authority, that the entire courtyard fell silent. Even the ambient sounds of London seemed to fade into the background, as if the city itself was holding its breath to hear what came next. Karen's mouth fell open, her phone wavering in her grip as she stared at James in shock. For the first time in the entire encounter, she was speechless, confronted by a presence and authority that her entitled worldview had no framework to process or understand. "I am Guardsman James Mitchell of Her Majesty's Coldstream Guards," James continued, his voice never rising above a conversational level, yet somehow commanding the attention of everyone within 100 yards. "I have served 3 tours of duty. In Afghanistan, where I had the honor of fighting alongside some of the finest soldiers this nation has ever produced." Each word was delivered with the precision of a military drill, measured and deliberate, carrying the weight of absolute truth. James wasn't shouting or becoming emotional. He was simply stating facts with the calm authority of someone who had nothing to prove but chose to educate an ignorant civilian about realities she couldn't begin to comprehend. "During my second deployment," he continued, his gaze never leaving Karen's face, "I was awarded the Military Cross for gallantry under fire. This occurred during a Taliban ambush in Helmand Province, where I made 4 separate trips through enemy fire to evacuate wounded soldiers who would have died without immediate assistance." The crowd was transfixed, hanging on every word of this quiet recitation of genuine heroism. Karen's phone had stopped recording, forgotten in her shock at finally being confronted by someone whose moral authority was unshakable and whose credentials were beyond dispute. "The rifle I carry," James said, indicating his weapon with the slightest movement of his eyes, "is not a prop, as you suggested. It is a, say, 808 assault rifle, fully functional and maintained to combat specifications. I am trained to use it with lethal precision, as are all members of my regiment." "Not actors, madam. We are soldiers." The words hit Karen like physical blows, each fact demolishing another piece of her elaborate conspiracy theory. But James was far from finished. Having established his credentials, he now began to educate this ignorant woman about the true nature of what she had so casually dismissed. "This uniform," he continued, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard, "represents over 350 years of military tradition. It has been worn by men who fought at Waterloo, who held the line at Ypres, who stormed the beaches of Normandy. Some of those men never came home, dying in service to ideals that you clearly cannot comprehend." Karen stumbled backward, her face cycling through various shades of red and white as the reality of her situation began to dawn on her. The confident smirk that had characterized her entire performance was gone, replaced by the dawning horror of someone who had just realized they had made a catastrophic mistake in front of dozens of witnesses, many of whom were recording every moment. "The medals on my chest," James continued relentlessly, his tone remaining perfectly controlled while delivering each word like a precision strike, "were not purchased from a costume shop, as you implied. They represent specific acts of service and valor, witnessed by my fellow soldiers and verified by my commanding officers. Each ribbon tells a story of sacrifice, dedication, and commitment to something greater than personal convenience or entertainment." Education was far from over. Having established his personal credentials and the authentic nature of his service, James now began to address the broader implications of Karen's ignorant accusations, speaking not just for himself but for every guardsman who had ever stood in his position. "When you question my authenticity," he said, his voice taking on an edge that suggested Karen had ventured into territory where even his exceptional patience had limits, "question the authenticity of every soldier who has ever worn this uniform. You dismiss the sacrifices made by men who gave their lives in service to their country and their fellow citizens. You reduce centuries of honor, tradition, and genuine sacrifice to the level of theme park entertainment." Karen opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, she found herself completely outmatched, facing someone whose moral authority was so absolute, whose credentials were so unshakable, that her usual tactics of intimidation and manufactured outrage were not just ineffective, but revealed as pathetically inadequate. "I have stood guard over the coffin of our late queen during her lying in state," James continued, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact. "I have protected foreign dignitaries whose lives were under threat from terrorist organizations. I have maintained the security of this historic fortress during alerts that never made the newspapers, threats that were neutralized before the public ever knew they existed." The crowd watched in fascination as James systematically dismantled every aspect of Karen's accusations, with the methodical precision of someone who had been trained to analyze and respond to genuine threats. But this wasn't just a defense of his own service, it was a masterclass in how a true professional handles disrespect with dignity and authority. "The duties I perform here," James said, his gaze still fixed steadily on Karen's increasingly uncomfortable face, "are not entertainment. For tourists, though I understand that visitors find them interesting, they are genuine security responsibilities, carried out by soldiers who have earned their positions through years of training, service, and demonstrated competence under the most challenging circumstances imaginable." Karen's phone had long since been forgotten, hanging loosely in her trembling hand as she tried to process the complete destruction of her worldview that was taking place before her eyes. The entitled confidence that had carried her through the entire confrontation was crumbling, replaced by the dawning realization that she had picked a fight with someone so far beyond her league that the contest wasn't even close to fair. "You asked for proof of my military service," James continued, his voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who was about to deliver a final, decisive blow. "My service record is a matter of public record, available through proper channels to anyone with legitimate reason to inquire. My awards and decorations are documented by the Ministry of Defense. My combat deployments are verified by the units I served with and the operations I participated in." The systematic destruction of Karen's accusations was nearly complete.
Oh.
But James had saved the most devastating revelation for last. With the precision of a master strategist, he had built his case methodically, establishing his credentials and dismantling her conspiracy theories before delivering the final blow that would leave no doubt about the encounter's outcome. "But more importantly," he said, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard with the authority of absolute truth, "I have the respect and recognition of my fellow soldiers, my commanding officers, and my country. I have earned my position through service and sacrifice, not through loud demands and manufactured outrage. I represent something that cannot be purchased, cannot be demanded, and cannot be faked. Genuine honor earned through genuine service." The silence that followed was profound and complete. Karen stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a fish gasping for air, unable to formulate any response to such a thorough and dignified demolition of her accusations. A crowd of onlookers began to stir, some starting to applaud quietly, others simply shaking their heads in amazement at what they had just witnessed. Karen's humiliation and retreat in the aftermath of James Mitchell's devastating response hung in the morning air like the smoke from a battlefield where only one side had possessed real ammunition. Karen Thompson stood frozen in the center of Windsor Castle's courtyard, her designer outfit suddenly seeming like a costume herself, her manufactured confidence completely shattered by the encounter with genuine authority and authentic service. The woman who had strutted into the situation with such aggressive certainty now looked small, diminished, and utterly defeated. For the first time in what was probably decades, Karen found herself completely without words. Her mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but no sound emerged except for small, strangled gasps as her brain struggled to process what had just happened to her. She had entered this confrontation absolutely certain of her superiority, convinced that she could intimidate and manipulate this fake guard just as she had successfully bullied countless service workers throughout her life. Instead, she had encountered a force so far beyond her understanding that her entire worldview was cracking like ice under pressure. The crowd of onlookers had begun to murmur among themselves, their voices carrying a mixture of admiration for James's masterful response and contempt for Karen's behavior. Phones continued to record, capturing not just the moment of her defeat, but the complete transformation of her demeanor from aggressive entitlement to shocked humiliation. These videos would soon find their way to social media, where Karen's downfall would be viewed, shared, discussed by millions of people who would use her as an example of entitled behavior meeting its match. Karen stammered, her voice barely audible as she struggled to find some way to salvage her dignity from the wreckage of her accusations. But there was no recovery possible from such a thorough dismantling. Every argument she had made had been systematically destroyed, every assumption revealed as ignorant. Every insult turned back on herself with compound interest. Margaret, the tour guide, stepped forward with the kind of professional composure that comes from years of managing difficult situations. Her expression was carefully neutral, but those who looked closely could see the satisfaction in her eyes as she watched Karen's comeuppance unfold. "Mrs. Thompson," she said quietly, "I think it would be best if you rejoin the group now. We have a schedule to maintain." But Karen was beyond caring about tour schedules or group dynamics. The magnitude of her mistake was beginning to sink in, and with it came the horrifying realization that her behavior had been witnessed and recorded by dozens of people. In an age of viral videos and social media shaming, she was potentially looking at public humiliation on a scale that would follow her for years to come. The other tourists in the courtyard were no longer content to remain silent observers. Having witnessed James's dignified response to unprecedented disrespect, they began to express their own opinions about Karen's behavior, and their assessment was universally negative. "Absolutely disgraceful," muttered an elderly British woman, shaking her head in disapproval. "In my day, people had respect for those in uniform. She should be ashamed of herself," added a middle-aged man with an American accent, perhaps feeling the need to distance himself from his countrywoman's behavior. "That soldier showed more class in 2 minutes than she's shown in her entire life." A young mother holding her daughter's hand used the moment as a teaching opportunity. "This is why we always treat people with respect, especially those who serve our country," she explained quietly to her child. "That man is a real hero, and the lady was very wrong to speak to him that way." The consensus was clear and overwhelming. Karen had not just lost this confrontation, she had humiliated herself completely in front of witnesses who would remember her behavior for years to come. But perhaps worst of all, from Karen's perspective, was the growing realization that she had no recourse, no comeback, no way to regain the upper hand in a situation that had spiraled completely beyond her control. James himself had returned to his position of attention. His brief but devastating intervention complete. He had said what needed to be said, educated an ignorant civilian about the realities of military service, and defended the honor of his regiment with the kind of quiet authority that could only come from genuine experience and unshakable conviction. Now he stood once again in perfect stillness, his duty resuming as if the interruption had been nothing more than a minor distraction. But the impact of his words continued to reverberate through the crowd and most importantly, through Karen's shattered confidence. She looked around desperately, seeking some source of support or validation, but found only disapproving faces and recording devices capturing her humiliation for posterity. The crowd that had initially been neutral observers had become an audience to her downfall, and their verdict was unanimous and damning. "I think," she began weakly, then stopped, realizing that anything she said would only make her situation worse. There was no argument she could make, no explanation she could offer, no way to spin her behavior into something acceptable or justified. She had been wrong on every level, and everyone present knew it. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sounds of London traffic and the whispered conversations of tourists discussing what they had just witnessed. Karen stood in the center of it all, a figure of such complete defeat that some observers actually began to feel sorry for her, despite their disgust at her earlier behavior. Finally, with her face burning with shame and her hands trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline, Karen began to back away from James's position. Her retreat was not dignified or graceful, but rather the panicked withdrawal of someone who had finally realized they were completely outmatched and desperately needed to escape before their humiliation became even more complete. "This isn't over," she mumbled weakly. But the words carried no conviction, no threat, no promise of future action. They were the empty protestations of someone who knew they had lost definitively and completely, but who couldn't quite bring themselves to admit it openly. "Actually, ma'am, it is over," Margaret said firmly, her professional patience finally exhausted. "You've disrupted our tour, insulted a decorated war veteran, and embarrassed yourself and your fellow tourists. Going to have to ask you to leave the premises immediately." The formal ejection was the final humiliation, the ultimate acknowledgement that Karen's behavior had been so far beyond acceptable, that she was no longer welcome at one of Britain's most prestigious tourist destinations. Security guards, summoned by Margaret's discreet signal, appeared at the edges of the courtyard, ready to escort Karen off the premises if necessary. But escort wouldn't be needed. Karen's spirit was completely broken, her confidence shattered, her sense of superiority demolished by the encounter with someone who possessed genuine authority and authentic credentials. With her head down and her designer heels clicking rapidly against the ancient cobblestones, she hurried toward the exit. Desperate to escape the scene of her humiliation before her defeat became even more public and complete, the crowd watched her go in silence, some with satisfaction, others with the kind of uncomfortable pity reserved for those who have brought disaster entirely upon themselves. As Karen disappeared through the castle gates, probably never to return, the normal sounds of tourist activity gradually resumed. But the memory of what had just occurred would linger in the minds of everyone present. James Mitchell continued his duty with the same professional dedication he had shown before Karen's arrival, and throughout her ill-conceived attack on his honor. The incident was over, but its impact would resonate far beyond Windsor Castle's walls, serving as a powerful reminder that genuine respect must be earned, that authentic authority cannot be challenged by mere loudness, and that true professionalism can triumph over entitled aggression through quiet dignity and unshakable truth. Karen Thompson had come to Windsor Castle expecting to dominate and control, to bend others to her will through sheer force of personality and manufactured outrage. Instead, she had encountered something she had never experienced before, a person whose moral authority was absolute, whose credentials were unshakable, and whose dignity could not be compromised by her tactics. The lesson she received that morning would haunt her for the rest of her life, a permanent reminder of the difference between earned respect and demanded attention, between authentic service and empty entitlement,